They laughed when the old man's brother left him nothing but a broken-down fishing boat. Then his dog found what was hidden inside it, and nothing was ever the same again. When Norbert Hale walked into that lawyer's office in Shreveport, Louisiana, he already knew he didn't belong there. His boots were wrong. Work boots, steel-toed, caked with red clay from the yard, and everyone else in that room wore shoes that had never touched unpaved ground. His nephew Preston sat near the window in a pressed blazer. Preston's wife, Dana, sat beside him with a yellow legal pad balanced on her knee. Norbert's niece Cora arrived last, sliding into the chair nearest the door without making eye contact with anyone, which was her way of saying she knew exactly how this was going to go. Norbert sat in the corner. His Belgian Malinois, Copper, settled beneath the chair without being told. The dog pressed his warm side against Norbert's ankle and didn't move. The lawyer was a small man named Mr. Thibodeau, gray-haired, soft-spoken, the kind of man who delivered bad news the way a doctor did, steadily without flinching. He opened the file. He read from the top. Cecil Hale, Norbert's older brother by 11 years, had died 3 weeks earlier in his sleep in the same house where both of them had grown up. Cecil had been a difficult man, sharp-tongued, particular, the kind of person who remembered every slight and catalogued them quietly. He had done well for himself in the river shipping business in the 1990s. He had done less well in the decades after, though no one in the family knew the full picture. Mr. Thibodeau read through the list without pause. The house in Shreveport, valued at $400,000, went to Preston. The 40-acre parcel of land outside Minden went to Cora. The savings accounts and investment portfolio went to be divided equally between Preston and Cora. The classic truck collection stored in Cecil's barn went to Preston's oldest son. Then Mr. Thibodeau turned a page. To his younger brother, Norbert Hale, Cecil leaves the fishing vessel Miss Ida, currently moored at Caddo Lake Marina. Preston turned his head toward Norbert slowly. The corner of his mouth moved. Cora looked at her legal pad. Dana pressed her lips together to keep something inside. Miss Ida, Preston said finally, his voice carrying just enough amusement to fill the room. He paused. That old thing. The Miss Ida was a 32-foot wooden hull boat that had been sitting at the Caddo Lake Marina for at least 6 years without moving. Norbert had seen it once, maybe twice, in all that time. Cecil had bought it in the early 2000s, with the idea of running charter fishing trips on the lake. That idea had lasted approximately 1 season before Cecil lost interest. Since then, the boat had sat, the wood had swelled, paint had peeled, the engine had rusted into something that mechanics at the marina refused to describe with optimism. Preston's voice came again, quieter. Meant more for Dana than for anyone else. He got the boat. Dana made a small sound that wasn't a laugh but was close enough. Norbert looked at the wall. Copper shifted slightly under the chair, the dog's ears turning once toward Preston and then going flat again. When the reading was finished, Mr. Thibodeau handed envelopes to Preston and Cora. He looked toward Norbert. There's a transfer of title document for the vessel, he said. We can complete it this week if you'd like. Norbert nodded once. Fine. Preston stood and adjusted his blazer. Well, he looked at Norbert with the particular expression of a man who has won something he didn't have to fight for. I guess you'll have to figure out what to do with it. Norbert didn't answer. He put his hand on Copper's back and stood slowly. His knees ached the way they always did in cold weather. A leftover from 22 years in the army. 2 tours in the Gulf, 1 in Afghanistan. The body remembered everything whether you wanted it to or not. He thanked Mr. Thibodeau and walked outside into the gray November morning. Copper walked beside him. The dog didn't need a leash in open spaces. He stayed exactly where he was supposed to be. Norbert sat in the truck for a moment before starting the engine. He looked out through the windshield at the parking lot. He was 63 years old. He lived alone in a small house outside Mansfield that he had paid off 7 years ago. He fixed small engines for a living, lawn mowers, generators, chainsaws, the occasional outboard motor, and he made enough to get by. He had no savings worth mentioning. His pension from the army helped. It didn't transform anything. He had not expected much from Cecil's will. Cecil had never been generous with him, not in life and not in feeling. But he had not expected to be the punchline either. He started the engine. Copper settled into the passenger seat. "Well," Norbert said, "guess we're boat owners." Copper looked at him with those yellow amber eyes, steady and calm, and said nothing. The drive to Caddo Lake took about 40 minutes. Norbert had not been out to the marina in years, and the road felt longer than he remembered. The cypress trees along the bayou were bare in November, their gray trunks rising out of the still water. Fog moved slowly between them. The lake had a quality in that season that felt like the world had gone quiet on purpose. The marina manager was a sun-weathered man named Burl, who chewed tobacco and kept the slip records in a physical notebook. He walked Norbert out along the dock, to the end slip without saying much. When they reached the boat, Burl stopped, stuck his hands in his jacket pockets, and looked at it the way a man looks at something he has given up on. "She's yours now, I suppose," he said. Norbert stood on the dock and looked at the Miss Ida. It was worse than he'd remembered. The hull had gone dark with moisture and algae. The cabin windows were clouded. One of the cleats had pulled loose from the railing, leaving a jagged hole. The name on the transom, hand-painted in blue letters, had faded until the letters were barely there. Copper stepped forward to the edge of the dock and sniffed the salt air coming off the water. He sniffed the ropes. He sniffed the edge of the hull where it met the floating dock. Then he stopped. He stood very still, nose pointed toward the boat, ears forward. "He does that," Norbert said quietly. Burl glanced at the dog. "What kind is he?" "Belgian Malinois, military working dog. He was attached to my last unit in Kandahar. When he aged out of service, I took him home." Burl looked at Copper with more respect than he'd had a moment before. "Good animal, the best." Copper had not moved. He was still focused on the boat. Not the hull, not the ropes. He seemed to be pointing at something near the stern, at the wooden storage bench that ran along the back wall of the cabin. The same kind of focused stillness that Norbert had seen him use in Afghanistan, when he'd found things buried under sand, under floorboards, behind false walls. Norbert knew that look. He climbed aboard carefully. The deck shifted under his weight but held. He made his way to the cabin and pushed the door open. Inside, the smell was damp wood and engine oil and closed air. Afternoon light came through the clouded windows in a pale, flat way that made everything look old. Copper jumped aboard behind him and went directly to the storage bench at the rear of the cabin. He sat in front of it and looked back at Norbert. Then he looked at the bench. Then back at Norbert. "All right," Norbert said. He walked over. The bench had a hinged lid for storage, the kind built into older boats to store life vests and rope and whatever else needed a dry place. Norbert lifted the lid. Inside were exactly those things. 2 old life vests, a coil of dock line, a flare kit past its expiration, a rusted hand pump. He moved them aside. Copper made a low sound, not a bark, a sound at the back of his throat, deliberate. Norbert looked closer. He ran his hand along the inside wall of the bench. The wood felt different in one section, not the weathered softness of the rest of the boat, but something denser. He knocked lightly with his knuckle. The sound was not right, too shallow, too hollow. He knocked on the section beside it. The difference was clear. "That's not solid," he muttered. Copper's tail moved once. Norbert examined the interior wall more carefully. There was a seam, thin enough to miss if you weren't looking, running in a rectangle roughly 12 inches wide and 18 inches tall. At the bottom of the rectangle, nearly invisible, a small brass fitting, the size of a coat button, had been set flush into the wood. It looked like a decorative fastener. It was not. He pressed it with his thumb. Nothing happened. He pressed and turned it slightly to the left. A soft click. The panel shifted inward 1/4 of an inch. Norbert sat back on his heels and stared at it. He pressed the panel gently. It swung inward on a hidden hinge, revealing a space behind it. A narrow vertical cavity running up inside the bench wall, maybe 8 inches deep and 2 feet tall. The interior was lined with wax paper, layered carefully, and behind the wax paper were packages. flat, rectangular, wrapped in the same wax paper, and sealed with old electrical tape. Norbert reached inside and pulled one out. It was heavy. He set it on the bench and peeled back the tape, then the wax paper. Inside was money, banded stacks of $100 bills, 10 to a band. Each band labeled with a small slip of paper in Cecil's handwriting. Norbert recognized the script immediately. Tight, slanted, the lowercase letters barely distinguishable from one another. He sat on the bench and held the stack. Then he put it down and pulled out another package, then another. He laid them out across the cabin floor, the waxed paper falling away from each one. Copper sat nearby watching him with calm, patient eyes. There were more packages behind the first layer. A second row, then a third, packed floor to ceiling in the hidden cavity. Norbert got out his phone and turned on the flashlight. He shined it into the space and counted, then counted again. He sat down on the cabin floor. The damp wood was cold through his jeans. He looked at the stacks of money arranged in front of him, looked at the hidden compartment, looked at Copper. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Cecil, what did you do?" He didn't go home that night. He slept in the truck in the marina parking lot with Copper across the back seat, and in the morning he drove into Shreveport and found a lawyer who was not Mr. Thibodeau. He sat across from a woman named Maureen Estevez in a small office near the courthouse and told her what he had found. All of it. He set one of the packages on her desk. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Do you know where this came from?" "No. My brother ran a shipping company starting in the mid-90s. He sold it sometime around 2005 or 2006. That's all I know." She sat back in her chair. "Have you told anyone else?" "No." "Good." She folded her hands on the desk. "Don't." Norbert didn't sleep well in the days that followed. He drove back to the Lake Trois and sat on the boat with Copper in the evenings, not opening the hidden panel, just sitting with the knowledge of it, the way you sit with something large you don't know how to hold yet. He ate badly. He forgot to check the weather before going out for firewood one morning, and got caught in a hard November rain that left him soaked and coughing for 2 days. He was in the middle of that cough when Preston called. His nephew's voice was different on the phone than it had been in the lawyer's office. Careful, like a man measuring each word before setting it down. "Uncle Norbert." He paused. "I've been thinking about the boat." Norbert waited. "I know you probably don't have much use for it," Preston continued. "I just wanted to say, if you ever wanted to, I don't know, get rid of it. Sell it for scrap or whatever. I'd be happy to take it off your hands. Save you the marina fees." Norbert said, "I'll think about it." Preston said, "Of course, no pressure." And then added, casually enough to be suspicious, "You haven't had a chance to look it over, have you?" "The boat? I've been out there once." "Oh." A pause. "Anything interesting?" "Just an old boat." Another pause, longer this time. "Right. Well, you let me know." Norbert hung up. He looked at Copper, who had been lying on the floor watching the phone call, with the attentive disinterest of a dog who understands tone if not words. "He knows something," Norbert said. "Or he thinks he does." Copper's ears moved. Norbert called Maureen Estevez the next morning. That same afternoon, 3 days after Norbert had found what he found, he drove back to the marina. He went aboard and, for the first time, began the work of counting properly. He spent 4 hours on that boat with Copper beside him, using a notepad and a calculator he'd picked up at a gas station. He sorted the packages into groups, counted the bands, added and re-added. Some of the bills were older, the ink slightly faded, the paper softer. All of them were real. When he finished, he set the calculator on the bench and looked at the number. He looked at it again. $47,800,000. He sat very still for a moment. Then he let out a slow breath that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite anything else. Copper came over and pressed his head against Norbert's knee. "I know," Norbert said. "I know." He packed everything back into the hidden compartment, exactly as he had found it. He replaced the brass fitting, pressed the panel shut, listened for the click. He arranged the life vests and rope on top of everything inside the bench lid, and closed it. Then he went home and called Maureen Estevez again. The call from Maureen came 4 days later. She had done research. Cecil Hale's shipping company, Hale River Transport, had been audited twice by federal tax authorities in its final years of operation, once in 2003 and once in 2005, the year before Cecil sold it. Both audits had been resolved with no finding of wrongdoing. But the financial records from the company's later period were incomplete. There was a gap, significant enough that Maureen had noticed it. She said carefully, "The money you found was almost certainly proceeds from his business, given when it was likely set aside and how it was stored. There are no red flags indicating it came from anything criminal. But I want to be thorough." 3 more weeks passed before she called back with a cleaner answer. The money was Cecil's. It had been off the books, set aside quietly, in cash, over years, but it was traceable to legitimate revenue from the shipping operation. Cecil had simply decided, for reasons that would never be fully clear, not to put it into an account where it could be easily found, argued over, or taxed in ways he didn't control. He hid it, Maureen said, methodically, over a long time. And then he left the only place it could be found to the one person he apparently trusted to handle it honestly. Norbert sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "He never told me he trusted me." Maureen was quiet for a second. Maybe that was the only way he knew how to say it. Preston showed up at the marina on a Saturday. He didn't call ahead. Norbert's truck was visible from the dock, which meant Preston had come there, knowing he'd find someone to talk to. He had a man with him, younger, carrying a flashlight and a small tool case, who he introduced as a marine surveyor, said he was looking into the possibility of restoring the boat. Norbert stood on the deck and watched them climb aboard. "She's not for sale," he said. Preston smiled the way he'd smiled in the lawyer's office, just curious. He walked toward the cabin. The younger man followed. Copper appeared in the cabin doorway immediately, and the younger man stopped. Copper wasn't growling. He was simply standing, blocking, yellow eyes steady. Preston said, "That dog still with you?" "He goes where I go." Preston looked at Copper for a moment, then looked past him into the cabin, trying to see the bench without being obvious about it. He said, "I just want to take a look around, family sentiment and all that." "This boat belongs to me," Norbert said. Cecil put that in writing. Preston's expression changed slightly, just a fraction. The smile didn't leave entirely, but something behind it shifted. He said, "Uncle Norbert, I just think it's strange that Cecil would leave you this over everything else. Don't you?" He gestured vaguely at the boat. "This thing?" Norbert looked at him evenly. "Did you know him better than I did?" Preston blinked. "Then you know better than I do what he meant by it," Norbert said. Preston stood on the deck for a moment. Then he turned to the younger man. "Let's go." They left. Copper walked to the stern and watched them drive away. Then he returned to the cabin and sat down in front of the storage bench in his usual way. "You keep doing that," Norbert said, "even when it's all put back." Copper looked at him. Norbert sat down in the old captain's chair in the corner of the cabin. Outside, the cypress trees on the far bank moved slowly in a light wind. A great blue heron landed on a piling at the end of the dock and stood there without moving as they do. He thought about Cecil. His brother had been 10 years old when Norbert was born. By the time Norbert was old enough to understand family dynamics, Cecil was already grown and gone, out of the house, building something. They had not been close in the way that proximity makes people close, but they had been connected in some other way. A way that did not require regular phone calls or holiday dinners. Norbert had always assumed Cecil found him embarrassing. The younger brother who went into the military instead of business, who never made money at scale, who fixed engines and lived quietly in a small house. Cecil had never said anything to contradict that assumption. And yet, here was the boat. Here was the money. Here was something Cecil had never said out loud. Norbert leaned forward and rested his arms on his knees. "You figured it out before I did," he said to Copper. The dog looked at him with those calm amber eyes. Norbert rubbed the dog's broad head. "You always do." The lawsuit arrived 6 weeks later, delivered by a process server to Norbert's house on a Tuesday morning. Preston and Cora, jointly, were contesting Cecil's will on the grounds that the vessel transfer had been made under undue influence, and further alleging that the estate contained undisclosed assets that had been intentionally concealed. The filing named the Miss Ida specifically. Norbert sat at his kitchen table and read it twice. Then he called Maureen. She said, "I expected this. Are you ready to go forward?" He said, "Yes." The hearing was held in Caddo Parish District Court in March, when the cypress trees along the bayou were just beginning to green. Norbert arrived early with Copper, who was not permitted inside the courtroom, but stayed in the truck in the parking lot with the windows cracked. Norbert checked on him twice before the session began. Preston's attorneys were smooth and expensive. They spoke about family intention and the unusually modest value of a vessel in severe disrepair relative to the rest of the estate. They implied, without saying directly, that there was something aboard the Miss Ida worth far more than the boat's physical condition would suggest. The judge was a heavy-set woman named Honorable Patricia Fontenot, who had been on the bench for 19 years, and who had the particular expression of someone who has heard many variations of the same story. She let both sides finish completely before she spoke. Then she asked Norbert's attorney one question. Was the transfer of the vessel to the defendant executed in a legally valid will, signed and witnessed according to Louisiana law? Maureen said, "Yes, Your Honor, without question." Judge Fontenot looked at the filing from Preston and Cora's attorneys. She looked at the will. She read the specific language of the bequest. She set both documents down. She said, "I find no evidence of undue influence in the original bequest. The vessels was clearly and specifically identified in the will of the deceased. The plaintiff's claim that undisclosed estate assets exist aboard the vessel is speculative and unsupported by any physical evidence introduced in this proceeding." She looked over her glasses toward Preston's table. "The court finds for the defendant. The will stands as written." Preston's jaw tightened. Cora stared at the table. Dana, seated behind them in the gallery, made no sound. Norbert sat still. He had learned in the army not to react to outcomes immediately, to let them settle first. Outside, he walked back to his truck across the parking lot. Copper raised his head when he heard the footsteps. When Norbert opened the door, the dog stood and pressed forward, tail moving. Norbert sat in the driver's seat for a moment and put his hand on the dog's neck. "We're all right," he said. Copper pushed his forehead against Norbert's hand. They drove back to the lake. Spring came on slowly to Caddo Lake. Warm water returned to the shallows. The cypress knees rose from the surface, and the Spanish moss came back to the trees in long gray curtains. Egrets worked the shallower coves. The heron came back to the end of the dock. Norbert had been working on the Miss Ida since February. He brought tools from home, stripped the old paint from the hull, replaced the rotted planks in the deck. He found a retired marine mechanic outside of Marshall, Texas, who came out twice a week and helped him rebuild the engine. The work went slowly and cost money he had not expected to spend, but he didn't touch the contents of the hidden compartment to pay for it. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because spending that money felt like a decision that needed to be made separately, deliberately, once everything else was settled. Maureen Esteves had confirmed by then that the funds were legally Norbert's. Clean provenance, clearly traceable to Cecil's legitimate business, no outstanding liens or claims. $47,800,000. His to do with as he chose. He chose slowly. He started with two things he understood. The first was a land purchase outside of Shreveport, 40 acres of flat piney land, with a good well and a wide barn. He bought it without drama, without announcement, without telling Preston or Cora. He paid cash through Maureen's office. The second was a phone call he made in April to an organization in San Antonio that he had learned about from another veteran at a VA appointment the previous year. A nonprofit that trained and placed service dogs with veterans living with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. He had been thinking about that call for months. He asked about making a donation. The woman on the other end explained their programs. Their wait list was long. Their funding was inconsistent. The cost of training a single service dog through placement was significant, and they were turning away veterans they couldn't afford to serve. Norbert asked how many veterans were on the wait list. She said, "Currently, 112. He said, "What would it take to clear it?" A pause. "I'm sorry? To clear the list. All 112. What would that cost?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds. Then the woman said, "Are you serious?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." They worked out the number over 3 calls. Norbert gave them enough to clear the current wait list and endow a fund that would sustain operations for 10 years. He asked that none of the donation be made public under his name. He asked that they use Copper's name instead, if they needed a name at all. The woman laughed on the phone, the surprised kind. She said, "Copper?" "Belgian Malinois," Norbert said. He found the money. Seemed right. He heard her laugh again, softer this time. In June, Norbert drove back to the marina and spent a morning on the Miss Ida alone. The engine ran now. The hull was clean. The paint was fresh. White, with the name repainted in the original blue. He sat in the captain's chair, with the cabin door open and the warm lakeside air moving through. And he looked at the storage bench for a long time. He got up eventually and opened the bench lid. He moved the life vests aside and pressed the brass fitting. The hidden panel swung open. The compartment was empty now, had been for weeks, everything properly transferred and documented. But he reached inside anyway and ran his hand along the smooth wax paper lining Cecil had put there. Careful, methodical work, the kind of thing that takes patience and intention. He thought about Cecil as a young man. Someone Norbert had barely known because he'd been too young to know him. He thought about 2 brothers who had never found the language for what they actually meant to each other. He thought about a will being written somewhere in private, a lawyer consulted, a decision made about a boat that everyone else would dismiss. He pressed his hand flat against the empty wall of the compartment. It was just wood now. Old cypress, smooth and dry. He closed the panel. He listened for the click. He rearranged the life vests and closed the bench lid. Then he stood up and walked out to the deck. Copper was at the stern, looking out at the lake. The water was green and still in the morning light. Spanish moss drifted from the cypress branches over the far shore. A turtle climbed onto a log and sat there without urgency. Norbert stood beside the dog and looked out at the same water. "I know you found it," he said quietly, "but he put it there." Copper's tail moved once, slow. They stood there for a while, the man and the dog, on a boat that had been called worthless and was now clean and running and theirs. The lake didn't care about any of it. The herons worked the shallows. The moss moved in the wind. The morning held. Some things don't need more than that.